It's time for us to get real and start working with async data. So far, our application worked with in-memory test data. I cannot do that anymore. We need to work with async data. And to do that, instead of faking an asynchronous API on the client, we're going to fake an asynchronous API on the server because we're doing full stack. And we want to make sure that our application is going to a server render even with async data. So this involves coding a little bit in Express, but it's really easy. In server.js, we're going to import data from test data, just like we did on the client, but now we're doing this on the server side. And in here, we are going to expose data as an API with the /data endpoint. The code is actually really simple. We just send this data. And Express is going to figure out that this is a JSON object. Let's actually test that. We'll go to localhost/data, and you should see the data now in an API endpoint. Very good. So now back to the client code. Now we have an API endpoint to fetch the data from, which means we need an Ajax library to do the fetching for us. My go-to library is Axios. And we can't read the data directly in the constructor here because now the data is asynchronous, which means I need something like component didMount to start fetching the data. So that's exactly what we're going to do next. We're going to use axios.getCall for /data, which is the API that we just prepared. Now this is an asynchronous call, so we can simply await on it just like that. And I'll go ahead and put that in a constant. I'm going to call this raw data here as well. Now, since this is an await call, that means that we need to label this function as async. And then I can have my API. So I can do the same API call we did before. So new data API for raw data that I just got from the API. And once I have the API, I can use a set state call. So I'm going to set the state to articles is api.getArticles, and authors is api.getAuthors. Very simple. Previous state is not used here. So we can actually simply just use this object directly in the set state argument, but I like to always use the function argument just to make that into a habit. But we can actually just simply make that into the direct return here to simplify the code. So to test, we first need to bring in Axios. So yarn add Axios. And when that is done, we'll restart Webpack, make sure it compiles correctly, and go test. Okay, so cannot read property articles of null. Why is that happening? Well, our application assumed the existence of an articles object at the initial render. Before we go here, before the async, the application assumes that there is an articles object on the state. So we can fix this in one of many ways. We can, for example, render something else here if we don't have an articles or an authors object on the state, or we can simply just have an empty articles authors object on the state when the app component is getting mounted initially, just like that. So authors and articles are both empty objects. Let's test. Getting another error, cannot read property reduce of undefined. And this is actually because the Axios response here is not the actual data that I'm interested in. It's a response object that wraps the actual data. So I'm going to call this response. And what I'm interested in here is response.data. Okay, so I think that should work, hopefully. And it did. Okay, great. What's happening server side? Are we good server side? And we can test that by disabling JavaScript and trying now. And we are not. Empty response. Why? Well, because this whole code here was not executed server side. The server executed the initial state, which rendered an empty list of articles. And that was it. There's no component didMount, there's no setting of the state, and the code server side remained representing an empty articles collection. So now, think about what we need to do in the server renderer to make the React application pre-render with the exact same async data that we fetched client-side. And don't assume that I can just import data here. I can't. The server side of this application will also need to fetch this data through Ajax. So just assume that this data is coming from a different node, not this exact node where the server is rendering.